All right, guys, we're going to spend some time to go through the Marbury versus Madison case. This is ultimately the case that gives the power of the Supreme Court. So you're gonna have a few that you're gonna have to do on your own, looking at Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona on a later assignment. This is just gonna be more like classwork, just me going through, explaining what I want you to do on future cases that you have to go through. Okay, this is the first major Supreme Court case that, like I said, ultimately gives the power of the Supreme Court. To the Supreme Court, and which is odd because it was the Supreme Court that decided it. So what I would want you guys to do is just identify this Marbury versus Madison, and the term I want you to think of, and this was from our notes earlier, it's called judicial review. Okay, judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court. That's what allows them to decide whether or not actions of the government or laws are constitutional or not. And ultimately that case, the power came from this case, Marbury versus Madison. Okay, let me clear that and we'll go through this. Okay, so Marbury versus Madison was in 1803. In 1800, President John Adams ran to be reelected as president, but he lost to Thomas Jefferson. During his last weeks in office, Adams appointed a bunch of men to be justices of the peace. That's just a fancy word or statement for judges in the District of Columbia. Each man would receive a paper commission that would be signed and sealed. The commissions were prepared, but they were not sent before Adams left office. When President Jefferson took over, here's our key point here, he refused to send them. All right, so think of it this way. If you were just elected president and you show up to the Oval Office and you get in your desk and you're like, wait a minute, Mr. Jefferson never sent these in. So those judges he picked technically were never fully confirmed. So that would mean you as a new president, you could pick your own judges. All right. So Jefferson was probably like, yeah, I think I'm going to pick my own guys. I'm not going to pick or use the same people that Adams picked because, you know, they weren't of the same party. They weren't of the same group. So they would definitely have different choices for who they would want to be federal judges. Okay. So going on here, it says one man, William Marbury, was upset. He wanted to be a judge. So he asked the United States court to issue a legal order called a writ of mandamus. In this case, the writ would have required Marbury's commission to be delivered. So the writ of mandamus is ultimately a way the Supreme Court can hear the case, okay, directly. It wouldn't have to go through lower courts to do this. So the argument. So whenever we have a Supreme Court case, remember there's going to be an argument, and then the Supreme Court's going to have a decision, and then that decision is going to set what we call the precedents, okay? So it says, did you notice that Marbury didn't start in a regular local court? He started at the Supreme Court. Normally that would be backwards, but in 1789, Congress passed a law saying people could start at the Supreme Court. So this law here that was passed in 1789 is going to be in question now. And ultimately it's going to be, did Congress have the power to do that? All right. So if they didn't have the power to do this law, then that would be a violation of the Constitution. If they did, then that would be no violation of the Constitution. So that's what the Supreme Court's looking at. So in 1789, Congress had passed a law saying people could start at the Supreme Court if all they wanted was a writ of mandamus, a quick decision by the Supreme Court. Marbury argued that he was entitled to the writ because his commission had already been created. He also argued that the Supreme Court had the power to issue the writ. So that's the second question now we have to identify is, did they have the power to offer that writ? In other words, did they have the power to allow the Supreme Court to hear this case? So the decision, the Supreme Court argued that Marbury had a right to receive his commission, but disagreed that the court had the power to issue the writ. So there's an important statement there. Supreme Court disagreed that the court had the power to offer this writ. All right, so this is what's unique about the Supreme Court. Remember, they're not deciding on guilty or innocence, right? Or guilty or not guilty. So even if they think, you know, this should have gone through, that's fine. Or they could think you were guilty of a crime, but the Supreme Court says, you know what? They found that person guilty by violating his or her rights. Even if they were, you know, 100% guilty of that crime, the Supreme Court would have to rule against that person or in favor of that person to some extent, saying, you know, the rights were violated. So that guilty verdict shouldn't be allowed. All right, same thing here. Even though the Supreme Court said, yeah, Marbury should receive his commission to be a judge, but we don't, as the Supreme Court, have the power to offer or to issue that statement saying yes, he should be a judge. All right, so why? Because the Supreme Court gets its power directly from the Constitution, and the Constitution says only certain kinds of cases can start in the Supreme Court. That meant, this is going to be a key point here, the 1789 law passed by Congress was unconstitutional. I didn't mean to line that out, but so essentially the Supreme Court identified that this law in 1789 was an unconstitutional law. Congress did not have the power to allow more kinds of cases to start at the Supreme Court. Therefore, the Supreme Court said it could not help Marbury get his commission. All right, so now the precedents. Remember, the word precedents is the idea that, you know, the Supreme Court ruled this way. So ultimately, the Supreme Court said that that law by the U.S. Congress at the time was unconstitutional. So here's our precedents. Believe it or not, this is considered the most important case, one of the most important cases the Supreme Court has ever decided. That's because it was the first time the Supreme Court struck down an act of Congress as being unconstitutional. Oops. Sorry about that, guys. Didn't mean to put that in. So right there, we can identify that they're saying what is constitutional or not. Right. So this was the first time Congress struck down, or the Supreme Court, sorry, struck down an action of Congress as being unconstitutional. That the idea that the Supreme Court has the final say about what is constitutional is called judicial review. So there's our term. All right. So this is where the power of Supreme Court ultimately comes out of. It comes from this court case. Now, what's unique is at the moment, the Supreme Court, if they would have ruled the other way, Supreme Court really probably could have taken on a lot of extra power, all right? By saying, yeah, we have the power to say yes or no, that person gets to be a judge. But they said, no, we don't have the power to do that. And as a matter of fact, that law was unconstitutional. So because this is the first time that the Supreme Court is ruling in this way, it set the precedence for judicial review. Basically saying, okay, the Supreme Court's main power is to determine if actions or laws of government are constitutional or not. So judicial review lets the judicial branch do two things: interpret the Constitution and decide what it means, and two, to stop the executive and legislative branches from doing things that go against the Constitution. So in other words, determine whether or not actions or laws by the government are constitutional or not. It says the decision in Marbury versus Madison helps cement the judicial branch as equal with the other two branches of government by giving it equal power. All right, so what we would do then is in class, we would fill out this next sheet here, and you guys are going to fill these sheets out for some other Supreme Court cases as we go through the next next week or so. Just something simple like this. All right, this is what the sheet looks like. You just gotta kind of go back and forth between the two pages. Sorry about that. Share the case, not me. All right, so we want to scroll back up. Our date was 1803. And the case was Marbury versus Madison. So let me go back to the page you would fill out then. So the case was 1803, the date of the case. Power of the Supreme Court created by this case was judicial review. All right, so we would fill it in accordingly. Now you're going to do something similar to this with Miranda versus Arizona and Gideon versus Wainwright, and then some other cases that will deal with cases that dealt with high school students. Okay. So the question one, what was the issue involved with this case? The issue was whether or not, Supreme Court had the power to give Marbury his position as a judge. All right. And whether or not the law that Congress made was constitutional or not. And then question two, how did the Supreme Court rule? They ruled saying that the law that was passed by Congress was unconstitutional, and that the Supreme Court did not have the power to give Marbury that job. And the final question on these is always going to be, well, what is the precedence that this case created? In this case, the precedence that was created was that the idea of judicial review, that the Supreme Court has the power to determine if actions or laws by government are constitutional or not. And that was the precedence that was set by this case in the early 1800s, and that's the precedence that's been set all the way to 2020 today. All right, when the Supreme Court rules on a case today, sets the precedence, all lower level courts, all the way down to Will County Courthouse in Joliet, Illinois, has to follow that precedence as well. All right, so again, 3 things I want you to put together with this. All right, judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court, and it came from Marbury versus Madison. All right, Marbury versus Madison created judicial review, which is the power of the Supreme Court. Okay, if you kind of connect those 3 things, you will be good. You don't have to necessarily know the ins and outs of the case, but I do like going it over with you just so you understand where it came from. All right, so you'll be using similar ideas to go through a couple Supreme Court cases on your own as we go further into the unit.